It began with a silent change inside Buckingham Palace, one so discreet that even longtime staff failed to notice it at first. A familiar name vanished from internal clearance lists. A royal residence request was quietly denied. And then came the chilling confirmation that Prince Harry, once welcomed as the monarchy's rebellious son, was now facing restrictions unlike anything ever imposed on a senior royal before. What started as whispers behind gilded palace doors soon exploded into a constitutional storm no one inside the House of Windsor could ignore. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, palace officials had quietly defended Harry in public while privately struggling to contain the damage caused behind closed doors. But this time felt different. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace reportedly shifted from frustration to full-scale institutional alarm. Senior aides who once described Harry as difficult but manageable allegedly began using colder language words like unpredictable, vulnerable, compromised. Meetings once arranged without hesitation suddenly required layers of approval. Invitations that had once carried automatic access reportedly became conditional. Even longtime staff members were said to be confused by the sudden tightening of procedures surrounding the king's younger son. Some believed the changes were temporary. Others feared they marked the beginning of a permanent royal separation, unlike anything seen in modern monarchy. Behind the scenes, confidential discussions were said to have intensified after weeks of internal consultations involving senior courtiers, legal advisors, and security officials. The concern was no longer centered only on public image. According to royal insiders, the deeper fear revolved around trust. Every private conversation, every internal disagreement, every family tension now carried the terrifying possibility of becoming tomorrow's headline. That fear reportedly reached its highest levels after repeated anxieties inside palace walls about future disclosures and private royal conversations finding their way beyond the institution. The monarchy, built on discretion and silence, suddenly found itself confronting a crisis where silence itself no longer felt guaranteed. And somewhere in the center of that storm stood Prince William. While King Charles reportedly wrestled emotionally with the unbearable conflict between fatherhood and duty, insiders claimed William had become increasingly firm during private discussions. Those close to the palace suggested the Prince of Wales believed the monarchy had already absorbed too much instability, too many reputational wounds, too many years of emotional chaos hidden beneath ceremonial appearances. The future king, once seen as Harry's closest ally and protector, was now allegedly one of the strongest voices urging caution, structure, and distance. For palace staff who remembered the brothers as inseparable, the transformation felt almost impossible to process. What had once been a bond built through grief, loss, and shared public pressure had reportedly hardened into something colder, heavier, and deeply fractured. The restrictions themselves reportedly touched nearly every sensitive corner of royal life. Access to certain private meetings became limited. Residence arrangements allegedly faced new layers of scrutiny. Ceremonial appearances that once seemed automatic were now reportedly reviewed case by case, with discussions focused not only on optics but on risk. Even routine interactions inside royal circles were said to carry unusual tension. Staff members allegedly became hyper-aware of who attended meetings, what was discussed, and how information moved behind palace walls. The institution no longer appeared to be operating from trust alone. It was operating from caution. Yet the most devastating part of the crisis may not have been political at all. It was personal. Because beneath every protocol change and confidential restriction stood a father watching his family collapse in slow motion. King Charles reportedly understood the danger facing the monarchy, but insiders claim he also carried the emotional burden of knowing the crisis involved his own son. That conflict created what one palace source allegedly described as an unbearable divide between the crown and the man wearing it. Every decision risked deepening the fracture. Every compromise risked weakening the institution. And as tensions inside royal corridors continued to rise, many began quietly asking the same terrifying question. If the monarchy no longer trusted Prince Harry completely, how much further could this separation still go? But the palace's decision was not created overnight. It was the result of years of fractures, betrayals, and private confrontations that had finally reached a breaking point. Long before Buckingham Palace confirmed the new restrictions, there were already signs that Prince Harry's relationship with the royal institution had entered dangerous territory. Behind the carefully controlled smiles at public ceremonies, senior royals were reportedly wrestling with a growing fear that every private conversation, every strategic meeting, every emotional reconciliation could someday become public. And inside a monarchy built on discretion, that fear was becoming impossible to contain. What began as frustration slowly transformed into something far more serious. Palace insiders allegedly described an atmosphere where trust no longer felt stable, where even ordinary discussions carried invisible tension beneath them. Harry's memoir and explosive interviews did more than create embarrassing headlines. They reportedly shattered one of the oldest unwritten rules within the House of Windsor: private matters remain private, no matter how painful they become. For generations, the monarchy survived scandals because silence protected the institution. But suddenly, that silence appeared vulnerable. Every closed-door meeting reportedly carried the haunting possibility that its details could someday leave palace walls forever. The emotional damage inside the family was said to be immediate, but the institutional damage unfolded more slowly and far more dangerously. Senior courtiers allegedly began reassessing how information moved through royal circles. Internal conversations became tighter. Access reportedly became narrower. Staff members were quietly instructed to reduce unnecessary communication channels involving sensitive discussions, especially when constitutional matters or future royal planning were involved. What once operated through instinctive trust now reportedly functioned through layers of caution. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible to the outside world, but inside Buckingham Palace it signaled something devastating. The monarchy was beginning to treat one of its own as a potential risk to its internal stability. At the center of those tensions stood Prince William, whose private frustration was rumored to have deepened after repeated attempts at reconciliation failed to restore confidence between the brothers. Sources close to royal circles claimed William no longer viewed the crisis as merely emotional or personal. To him, according to insiders, it had become institutional. The future king reportedly feared that unresolved tensions with Harry could eventually interfere with matters far larger than family disagreements, state responsibilities, diplomatic relationships, constitutional appearances, and the long-term credibility of the crown itself. That realization allegedly hardened his position behind closed doors. What had once been heartbreak slowly evolved into caution. Then caution became distance. For many palace aides, the most alarming part was not the public conflict itself, but the growing realization that the monarchy's ancient survival strategy was beginning to fail under modern pressure. Never complain, never explain had protected generations of royals through wars, scandals, divorces, and public outrage. But now the institution faced something different. A family fracture unfolding in full global view, amplified by interviews, documentaries, memoirs, and constant media speculation. Every attempt to remain silent reportedly created even deeper suspicion outside palace walls, while every response risked escalating the crisis further. The monarchy appeared trapped between two impossible choices: speak and fuel the fire, or remain silent and allow mistrust to spread unchecked. And beneath all of it lingered an even darker fear that few inside the institution were willing to say aloud openly. If private conversations could no longer remain private, how could future reconciliation ever truly happen? Royal insiders allegedly worried that even sincere attempts to repair the relationship might eventually become impossible, because trust itself had been fundamentally damaged. Conversations once guided by family loyalty were now overshadowed by anxiety, hesitation, and strategic calculation. The brothers who once stood together against the world now reportedly operated from entirely separate realities. Each side carrying wounds the other no longer seemed capable of healing, and while the public believed reconciliation was still possible, private meetings inside Buckingham Palace were already moving in an entirely different direction. The meetings were never placed on the official court circular. No photographs emerged. No press briefing followed. Yet according to palace insiders, a series of confidential discussions involving senior advisors, legal aides, and members of the King's private office quietly reshaped Prince Harry's future within the monarchy. What was discussed inside those rooms reportedly went far beyond family tensions. It touched the very survival of royal protocol itself. By that stage, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace had reportedly become heavy with uncertainty. Senior officials were no longer debating temporary disagreements between brothers. They were confronting a far more dangerous question. How could the monarchy continue functioning smoothly while carrying internal fractures that refused to heal? Behind closed doors, advisors allegedly began reviewing Prince Harry's role in future state events with unusual intensity. Appearances once considered symbolic now carried constitutional weight. Seating arrangements, access privileges, private briefings, residence protocols, everything reportedly came under renewed examination. The institution that once operated on tradition and instinct was now moving carefully, almost defensively, as though every decision carried the risk of triggering another public crisis. Sources close to royal circles claimed discussions repeatedly returned to three deeply sensitive concerns: security, confidentiality, and trust. Those words echoed through palace corridors with growing urgency. Officials allegedly feared that future constitutional matters, private diplomatic conversations, or internal royal planning could become vulnerable if clear boundaries were not established immediately. The anxiety reportedly intensified because the monarchy was already navigating one of the most fragile periods in modern royal history. King Charles's ongoing health challenges had created a sense of instability beneath the surface, leaving courtiers increasingly desperate to avoid further disruption. The crown could withstand scandal. It could withstand criticism. But insiders allegedly feared it could not survive prolonged uncertainty at the very center of the institution. And at the heart of those emotionally charged meetings stood Prince William. According to multiple palace sources, the future king reportedly argued that the monarchy required clear operational boundaries moving forward. To some insiders, his position appeared cold. To others, it appeared necessary. William allegedly believed that blurred lines between private family relationships and institutional responsibilities had already caused years of damage. The problem, according to those close to the discussions, was no longer about forgiveness. It was about protecting the future stability of the crown. That distinction reportedly changed everything. Once the crisis became institutional rather than emotional, compromise itself became far more difficult. Still, King Charles reportedly resisted harsher measures for as long as possible. Those close to the monarch allegedly described him as deeply torn between duty and fatherhood, struggling privately with the emotional cost of every restriction under consideration. He reportedly understood the fears surrounding confidentiality and institutional trust, yet the reality remained painfully personal. This was not merely a constitutional problem. It was his son. Palace insiders claimed several meetings became emotionally charged, as advisors pushed opposing arguments, some urging caution and reconciliation, others insisting that hesitation would only deepen instability. The debates reportedly grew so intense that even longtime courtiers were left shaken by the emotional fractures exposed behind palace walls. Meanwhile, legal advisors quietly examined policies surrounding access to royal estates, private meetings, and future ceremonial involvement. Every discussion reportedly carried the same unspoken fear. If boundaries were not formally clarified now, the monarchy risked losing control over its own internal structure later. What terrified palace officials most was not one isolated controversy, but the possibility of an endless cycle of tension, disclosure, public fallout, and institutional damage repeating itself again and again. The crown, built over centuries on discipline and controlled silence, suddenly found itself confronting a modern reality it no longer fully understood. But the true shock came when whispers began spreading about what the new restrictions actually involved and how far Buckingham Palace was willing to go. When details of the alleged restrictions finally began leaking through palace administrative circles, even veteran royal observers were stunned. Reports suggested Prince Harry's access to certain royal residences had become heavily controlled, while invitations to sensitive gatherings were now subject to higher-level approval. For a prince born into the institution itself, the symbolism was devastating. This was no longer a temporary family disagreement. It was beginning to resemble a formal containment strategy. Inside royal circles, the reaction was reportedly immediate and deeply unsettling. Courtiers who had spent decades navigating scandals, divorces, and constitutional crises allegedly described this moment as uniquely painful because it carried an unmistakable message. The monarchy was quietly redefining the limits of trust within its own bloodline. Access to royal properties, once handled through long-established custom and personal familiarity, was now reportedly governed through stricter authorization procedures. Requests involving residences connected to the crown allegedly faced additional review layers, while private scheduling discussions became increasingly restricted to a smaller group of senior officials. What made the situation so shocking was not merely the administrative changes themselves, but what they symbolized beneath the surface. The institution no longer appeared willing to rely on tradition alone. At the same time, palace staff reportedly received updated communication guidance surrounding sensitive matters connected to Prince Harry. According to insiders, unnecessary information sharing was quietly discouraged, and conversations involving future ceremonial planning became far more tightly managed. Even routine logistical discussions allegedly carried an atmosphere of caution. Some staff members reportedly feared making mistakes. Others worried that the monarchy was slowly transforming into two separate realities, operating under one family name. The emotional weight of those changes reportedly spread far beyond official offices, because many inside the institution still remembered Harry not as a controversy, but as the young prince who once walked beside William through unimaginable public grief after Princess Diana's death. That contrast, the beloved prince of the past versus the restricted royal figure of the present, hung heavily over palace corridors. Meanwhile, speculation surrounding Harry's role in future ceremonial events only intensified the sense of instability. Sources close to royal operations claimed his involvement in major state occasions would now face significantly higher scrutiny moving forward. Every appearance reportedly required delicate calculations involving optics, security, protocol, and public reaction. The monarchy, already navigating immense pressure surrounding King Charles's health challenges and the future transition of power, allegedly feared additional unpredictability at the worst possible moment. Royal commentators began openly suggesting that Buckingham Palace had made a painful but deliberate choice: stability over sentiment, continuity over emotional reconciliation. Publicly, however, the palace maintained its familiar strategy of careful silence. No confirmation, no denial. Only the cold discipline of an institution determined to reveal nothing, while the speculation outside grew louder by the day. Yet among insiders, the language reportedly became increasingly blunt. Some allegedly described the entire strategy as institutional distancing, a phrase that carried enormous emotional and symbolic weight. It suggested that the monarchy was no longer simply managing family tensions behind closed doors. It was actively creating structural separation in order to protect itself from future disruption. For many royal observers, that realization marked the true turning point. The conflict had evolved far beyond emotional fallout from interviews or memoirs. It had entered the machinery of the institution itself, where policies, procedures, and protocols now reflected the fracture once hidden inside private family conversations. And still, beneath the layers of official caution and constitutional calculation, there remained something profoundly human at the center of the storm. Because behind every restricted invitation, every altered protocol, and every carefully managed silence stood a father confronting the unbearable collapse of trust within his own family. King Charles reportedly understood the fears consuming the institution, yet insiders claimed the emotional cost of those decisions weighed heavily on him in private moments. The crown demanded discipline, the monarchy demanded protection. But the wounded relationship underneath it all refused to disappear so easily. Yet behind the cold administrative language and controlled palace statements stood a far more painful reality, a father struggling between love for his son and duty to the crown. For King Charles, the crisis surrounding Prince Harry was never simply about headlines, interviews, or palace protocol. According to royal insiders, it became one of the most emotionally devastating struggles of his reign. At the same moment, Charles was already carrying the enormous weight of the crown, ongoing health concerns, and the future stability of the monarchy. He reportedly found himself trapped between two painful identities, a monarch sworn to protect the institution at all costs, and a father watching his family fracture in full public view. Behind palace walls, sources claimed Charles attempted several quiet reconciliation efforts, hoping private conversations could succeed where public silence had failed. But with every new controversy and every fresh wave of speculation, those hopes reportedly grew weaker. And while Charles struggled emotionally, another figure inside the monarchy was said to be becoming increasingly decisive: Prince William. No longer viewed simply as the future king, William allegedly emerged as the institution's stabilizing force during one of the most volatile periods in modern royal history. Insiders claimed he approached the situation not through emotion, but through survival. To William, according to palace sources, the monarchy could no longer operate on uncertainty, especially as fears surrounding confidentiality, public trust, and institutional vulnerability continued growing behind closed doors. Advisors reportedly supported stronger long-term boundaries surrounding Harry, believing ongoing instability around the crown risked damaging the monarchy far beyond temporary family tensions. The divide between the brothers, once viewed as deeply personal, allegedly hardened into something much larger after repeated public controversies. Palace insiders claimed William became increasingly protective not only of the crown, but of Catherine and their children as well. The future king reportedly feared that prolonged instability could eventually consume the next generation of royal life, placing even greater pressure on an institution already struggling to maintain public confidence. And as internal discussions intensified, sources suggested the balance of influence inside palace meetings began shifting heavily toward William's position. Senior advisors allegedly warned Charles that hesitation could deepen institutional damage, especially if future disclosures created new waves of public distrust. For Charles, that reality reportedly became unbearable. Every decision carried emotional consequences. Every compromise seemed to risk either the monarchy's stability or the collapse of what remained of family unity. Insiders claimed the king feared further public revelations could permanently damage trust inside the institution, leaving Buckingham Palace vulnerable during one of the most fragile chapters of his reign. And so, despite the emotional pain surrounding the situation, sources suggest Charles ultimately approved the restrictions in order to preserve the monarchy's long-term survival. But while the palace focused on protecting the future of the crown, the emotional cost of those decisions was already leaving scars across the entire royal family, and many began wondering whether this marked the final chapter of Prince Harry's royal role, or only the beginning of an even deeper conflict still waiting to unfold. Behind every protocol revision, every restricted invitation, and every carefully worded palace statement stood something far more painful than politics, a family unraveling in slow motion beneath the weight of history. Courtiers could draft policies, advisors could recommend safeguards, but none of them could erase the reality that the monarchy's most public fracture was unfolding between a father and son, between brothers who once seemed inseparable beneath the shadow of Princess Diana's legacy. Royal insiders reportedly described an atmosphere of deep sadness spreading through senior palace circles, where even major royal events allegedly carried emotional tension beneath the polished surface. Staff morale was said to have become increasingly fragile, with many privately acknowledging that the institution appeared wounded from within. At the center of that heartbreak remained the fractured relationship between Prince William and Prince Harry. Sources claimed the bond between the brothers had deteriorated so severely that reconciliation now felt distant, uncertain, and painfully complicated. Yet despite the restrictions and growing institutional distance, King Charles reportedly never fully abandoned hope that one day his family could heal. Insiders suggested the king continued wrestling privately with the emotional cost of every decision, knowing the crown demanded stability while his instincts as a father longed for peace. Meanwhile, Catherine was reportedly focused on shielding her children from the growing tensions surrounding the family, determined to protect the next generation from the emotional chaos consuming the monarchy behind closed doors. But while the emotional wounds deepened, Buckingham Palace itself appeared to be entering an entirely new era. Royal observers claimed the reported restrictions on Prince Harry symbolized something far larger than administrative policy. They reflected a monarchy becoming colder, more controlled, and increasingly focused on institutional survival above all else. Prince William was said to be taking on a greater role in shaping future royal decisions, while King Charles allegedly became more determined than ever to avoid further instability surrounding the crown. Palace insiders claimed trust had now become the monarchy's most guarded currency, protected with extraordinary caution after years of public controversy and internal fracture. Public opinion, however, remained sharply divided. Some believed the restrictions were necessary to preserve stability during one of the most delicate chapters in modern royal history. Others saw them as heartbreaking evidence of a family losing itself beneath centuries of duty and expectation. And hanging over everything was one haunting question no palace statement could fully silence. Could trust inside the royal family ever truly return once it had been broken so publicly? Royal historians reportedly warned that this moment may permanently redefine the boundaries of modern monarchy, establishing a future where personal relationships could no longer outweigh institutional protection. Because inside Buckingham Palace, where silence often carries more power than words, the message now appears unmistakably clear: the crown may forgive, but it never forgets. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.